I'm super excited about today's project because it is going to be cozy and it's going to be a little bit nerdy. It involves my favorite animal, the giraffe. If you're new here, hi, I'm Olga and I make sewing content that is usually vintage inspired and sometimes a little bit nerdy. I got this fabric a couple of months ago from Minerva. It is an organic cotton sateen and this print is called Safari Stature. I have pre-washed this, I know. I'm going to be making some pajamas out of it. I think I have like 5.5 meters if I'm not mistaken. And I think I only need around 4 to make the PJ set I'm thinking of. So I definitely have extra fabric that I'm going to use for something else. I just don't know what. So if you have ideas, let me know in the comments. I'm really excited to make these. I think these are going to be super breathable and super nice to wear to sleep. So plan for this is to use, I have this Burda pattern for unisex PJs. So they're quite like oversized and baggy, but like super comfy. And I made the smallest size that they had in that pattern out of like a really old IKEA duvet a couple of years ago, and they're one of my favorite PJs because they're so comfy. Yeah, I'm just gonna use the pattern as the original. I don't want to do the pockets though. Like I'll do pockets in the trousers, but I don't want to do pockets on the top because I don't like that. Yeah, that's it. That's the plan for today. First things first though, I think I need to press this because one of the things that annoys me about pre-washing fabric is that you have to then pre-press it because it's all wrinkly out of the machine. Let's go press 5.5 meters of fabric. I'm gonna press the whole thing now because if I only press what I need now, then I'm gonna have to press it again when I need the rest, and I might as well just have it over with. I actually timed how long it took me to press this, and it was around 6 minutes, so it wasn't as bad as I made it out in my head. I guess next time I don't want to press the fabric before cutting, I need to remind myself it's only like 5 minutes of my time. Now that I have it pressed, I'm gonna wrap it up again in some cardboard. The cardboard is really just to help do this movement more easily and to give it a bit of structure. Then, as always, I had to clear my desk to have space to work on this project. With my workspace clean and tidy, I got out my pattern for this PJ set and started placing the pattern pieces on the fabric to cut it out, trying to be strategic with my pattern placement. I almost forgot that this fabric is directional, but I did realize in time. Directional patterns can mean a bit more puzzling to avoid fabric wastage, but with a little patience, we got there. When I had all the pattern pieces on the fabric, I started cutting them out. I'm saving the offcuts to use for the English paper piecing quilt I'm working on. I'm super excited to add some giraffes to it. As I usually do, I'm going to be batch sewing this PJ set. So first I unpin the paper pieces from the fabric, and I'm pinning all the pieces I can together, starting with pinning the pockets to the trouser pieces with right sides together. Usually you want to pin this pocket to the top of the trouser or skirt panel so that you can sew the top into the waistband. But since these trousers have a roll down waistband kind of design, I need to pin the pockets where the actual waist will be. To work that out, I marked the seam allowance, then how much I want to fold these. I went with 5 centimeters, and then I actually fold that down. It's very easy to finger press this cotton, and then I pin the pocket so that I'll be able to stitch it into the waist later. I hope that made any sense. Once I figured it out, I measured the actual distance from the top of the pocket and the top of the trouser piece so I could replicate this on all the trouser pieces. Then I pinned the collar pieces to each other with right sides together along the outer edges, and the sleeve cuffs to the sleeves with right sides together as well. You can close the sleeve and then add the cuff, but I tried this method here recently and I thought it was much easier. Lastly, I pinned the front bodice pieces to the back with right sides together along the shoulders and sides. When I've pinned as much as I can for now, I start sewing these seams, making sure to backstitch at the start and finish of every seam to avoid it unraveling. To finish the raw edges, I'm going to be using my serger, so I'm just running all of the seams I stitched under the serger to trim and finish them in one go. For the collar, I do trim it by hand and clip the rounded corners to reduce bulk. I flipped the collar right side out and pressed it, as well as all of the other seams I just stitched in this batch. On the sleeves, after pressing the seam allowances towards the cuff, I pressed the seam allowance of the cuff and then folded and pressed the cuff in half as well. The next day, I started on the next batch. First, I pinned the front trouser pieces to each other with right sides together along the inseam, and I repeated that for the back pieces as well. Then I pinned each sleeve closed along the underarm seam with right sides together, as well as the collar to the bodice, and started sewing those seams. I went slow around the collar, making sure the bodice isn't bunching up or getting tucked under. This usually means I'm stopping every few stitches to pull the bodice fabric to remove these tucks from the area I'm currently sewing, and I hold my fingers over the fabric along the stitching lines so that I can feel if there's any tucks. The rest of the seams in this batch are much more straightforward, so I could sew them a little faster. Once I had all those seams sewn, I serged them too. Lastly, I pressed all those seams using my sleeve roll and Tailor's ham when needed. The next thing I did was pin the trouser fronts to the backs with right sides together along the side seams and pockets, adding a pin 8 centimeters up from the edge of the pocket to close it. I also pinned the inner legs, making sure I matched the inseams. On the bodice, I pinned the facings to the fronts with right sides together after having serged the edge that remains free. Then I stitched the bodice and facings carefully to avoid tucks, especially around the neckline. Here I also added some top stitching to the sleeve cuffs. I added one line of stitching along the seam joining the sleeve to the cuff, and then I added another one along the edge of the cuff just because I thought it would look cute. Lastly, I stitched the trouser seams up. I started with the sides, stitching up the pockets as I went and making sure to close the pocket too. I repeated that for the other leg and then also stitched the inner leg seam, taking it slow around the inseam. And of course, I finished all of my seams by serging them. When I pressed all those seams, I also pressed the waistband into place. I folded it 1.5 centimeters, which is my seam allowance, and pressed that down, and then I folded it a further 5 centimeters and pressed that in too. Now I can stitch that down, taking care around the pockets to make sure I'm catching them in this seam and that they're facing the front of the trousers, which I almost botched on one of the pockets, but I did rescue it in time. I'm also making sure to leave a gap to add the elastic later. Next, I leveled out the hem of the trousers, starting with one side and then placing the other leg under the one I just cut to match the length. Then I folded the the raw edge of the hem in twice and pin that down. I grabbed my trim stash to find some elastic. Ideally, I wanted to use a blue, even though it doesn't really matter because it won't be visible. I didn't have enough blue anyway, so I used a bit of white elastic I had, and ironically, it was the perfect amount. Then I used the safety pin trick to thread the elastic into the waistband. I like to use some good quality safety pins because it does make a difference in how smooth this whole thing goes. And then I just slowly move the elastic through until it comes out the other side of the gap I left. Here I make sure that there's no twist in the elastic before I pin the edges and heat seal them to avoid fraying. I also pinned the sleeves into the bodice with right sides together. I matched the underarm seams and pin out from there. This sleeve pattern doesn't have a left and right sleeve, so there's no need to match each sleeve to the correct side. Lastly, I flipped the bottom edge of the facings to the outside and marked the stitching line. I went with 3 centimeters, which is folding up the seam allowance twice. Now I could stitch those seams down. I started with the facings, making sure to backstitch at the start and finish. Then I stitched the sleeves in. To stitch the elastic, I used a zigzag stitch and go over a couple of times to make sure it's really secure. Then I could just close the gap I left in the waistband. I could now move on to the trouser hems and stitch those down along the fold, but I also added top stitching along the very edge of the hem, just like I did for the sleeve cuffs. I moved on to the serger for the last time in this project to finish the seam allowances of the sleeves along the armholes. Before I pressed those seams, I did trim just the facing of the bodice hem and flip it back to the inside. I used my point turner to make sure that the corner is nice and crisp. Then I pressed all of my seams. First, I pressed the hem of the trousers, then I used my tailor's ham to press the seam allowances of the sleeves, and lastly, I pressed the hem of the bodice in place with the help of my seam gauge. I started with pressing the whole hem up 3 centimeters, and then I folded the raw edge in so that it's hidden and pressed that as well. The trousers are now finished, but the top still needs some finishing touches. First, I top stitched the hem in place just like I did for the cuffs and the trousers, along the fold and then along the edge. Then I added a line of top stitching all around the front of the top, right into the collar and down the other side. I also top stitched the collar along the edge. Now all that's left is to pick out the buttons and then make the buttonholes and sew the buttons down. I was really struggling to pick out the right buttons, but then my partner and official button picker came in and saved the day by selecting these salmon colored vintage buttons. Then I played around with the placement and spacing until I was happy with how it looked, and I could mark the placement with my heat erasable pen as well as with pins because there were places where it was really hard to see the pen markings. With that done, I could make the buttonholes on my machine. Once I had all the buttonholes done and opened, I used them to mark the placement of the buttons on the other front opening edge of the top. And of course, I stitched my buttons down on the machine and I was ready for the reveal. Alright, so time for my wrap up. I'm really happy with how these turned out. They're so cute. They're really comfy. The sleeves are too long, but I kind of knew that the sleeves on this pattern are a little bit too long for me. So I usually just roll up the sleeves on my other PJ set that I have from this pattern. The trousers are perfect length. I'll probably just roll them up and call that a day. It's obviously oversized, but it makes it super comfy and very breathable and stuff. I haven't slept in it yet, but like from experience of this pattern, like it's not my first time making this pattern, so I kind of knew what I was getting. I just wanted it with giraffes on it. I don't know if you could spot in the reveal, but I am also wearing giraffe socks, and that was totally by accident. I did not plan that. I told you I'm obsessed with giraffes. That was not a lie. I think the buttons really add a fun pop of color, which is great. I thought that was a fun little touch. That's it. I don't really have anything else to say. I'll leave a link to the fabric and the pattern and everything else that I used in this video down below. Some of those links are affiliate links, so that would be greatly appreciated. It would really help keep this channel running and my work going as well. If you haven't already, you should consider subscribing to my channel because I post usually every Friday. You should also go check out my Instagram and TikTok. I post on there pretty much every day. That's it. Okay, thanks for watching and happy sewing.